Okay, so we're carrying on with Act 2, and we're looking first of all at Cecily. I've never met any really wicked person before. I feel rather frightened. I'm so afraid he will look just like everyone else. And so there's an interesting comparison here in terms of the way that these texts sort of other people, and that we have this sort of othering here going on in social terms, and that othering that goes on in the birthday party is completely indistinct. We have a sense of it being based really on simply orthodoxy and the extent to which we meet the expectations of orthodoxy as a performance. But here it's based seemingly on social class. Algernon then enters and seems very gay and debonair. He does. And then so here, there's this very clear suggestion that he's extrovert, and by being that way, looks just like everyone else. So we've got this sort of sense of the performative nature of this supposedly extrovert aesthete that I think Wilde is, to a certain extent, poking fun at himself here as some kind of, almost like an original hipster that mocking himself in his own self-consciousness. Further down, Algernon says, "Oh, I'm not really wicked at all, Cousin Cecily. You mustn't think that I'm wicked." And then he's put, "If you are not, then you have certainly been deceiving us all in a very inexcusable manner." And so the dramatic irony is wicked by Victorian standards, because it's actually not earnest. It's not straightforward. And so there's this deliberate exposure of this the hypocrisy of this particular series of social values here. And he says, this is in response. I see from your card are Uncle Jack's brother, my cousin Ergonist, my wicked cousin Ernest. So I'm not really wicked at all. And you've been deceiving us all in a very inexcusable manner. So we've been deceiving them simply by being, by actually being wicked and pretending to be wicked and not being wicked. But here, actually, what Wilde seems to be saying to us is that it's more important to pretend to be wicked than it is to own up to the honesty of being a normal human being, because it exposes the inconsistency of the story. And so that is hypocrisy, but it's hypocrisy on a kind of double level. Further over the page, the exchange between the two of them, he says, "The appointment is in London. Couldn't you miss it anywhere but in London?" "No, the appointment is in London. And it's about a business appointment." And then Cecily says, "Well, I know, of course, how important it is not to keep a business engagement if one wants to retain any sense of the beauty of life." And I think there's a similarity here in Blanche's approach, that deliberate evasion of the pragmatism of money and material wealth, as well as a contrast with Goldberg and McCann. Keeping business arrangements to Goldberg and McCann is what provides us with the stability and the consistency for an appreciation of the beauty of life. Further down, he talks about clothing. "I certainly wouldn't let Jack buy my outfit. He has no taste in neckties. I don't think you will require neckties. Uncle Jack is sending you to Australia. We said at dinner on Wednesday night that you would have to choose between this world, the next world, and Australia." And so I think there's a contrast with Blanche here, because they're kind of actively killing off their fabricated selves, whereas Blanche is seeking to sustain them. Blanche is constantly trying to keep her fabricated identities alive. Both of these characters are actually actively killing them off because they sense it is in their interest to do so. Further down, "This world is good enough for me, Cousin Cecily. Yes, but are you good enough for it? I'm afraid I'm not that. That is why I want you to reform me. You might make that your mission if you don't mind, Cousin Cecily." And so there's this, I think, contrast here between the way that Algernon is thinking of this in terms of a romantic relationship that reforms him, and that most definitely contrasts with Goldberg and McCann, because here we're talking about being good enough for this world and society itself. Whereas that's precisely what Goldberg and McCann locate in Stanley is an inadequacy based on the conventional understanding of orthodoxy. At the bottom of the page, it's rather quixotic of you, but I think you should try to reform himself. She's talking about, I will, I feel better already, you're looking a little worse, that's because I'm hungry. And so there's this sham again of the performance that he's pretending that he's reforming himself and he's really not, and actually the food is an expression of his sort of repressed sexuality. Cecily says, how thoughtless of me, I should have remembered that when one is going to lead an entirely new life, one requires regular and wholesome meals when you come in. And so that the food and repression of the impulsive nature of existence for Alvin, you know, the false identity that's necessitated by his repressive, the way his lifestyle is repressed and regulated, I think is in many ways comparable to the drink in Streetcar, that is about evading reality. So it's, you know, in many senses, it's about a struggle to negotiate reality, both of these symbols that are frequently used in the way that they are repeated as a motif. Further down, Algernon says, because you are like a pink rose, Cousin Cecily. And she says, I don't think it can be right for you to talk to me like that. Miss Prism never says such things to me. And Miss Prism is a short-sighted old lady. And again, that motif of vision, I think here shows us that actually the inadequacy of orthodox figures in terms of their appreciation of beauty and an aesthetic. And I think we see then a similarity that's very logical between Blanche and Algernon. They are both aesthetes. They both see the reality through those aesthetic lenses. Miss Prism says that all good looks are a snare, and then Algernon says they're a snare that every sensible man would like to be caught in. Oh, I don't think I would care to catch a sensible man. I shouldn't know what to talk to him here about. And so there's this opposition, I think, here between what Cecily is confidently looking for and what Blanche is looking for. Blanche is looking for a kind of an outmoded, chivalrous, good man. Here, Cecily is actively searching for a sort of an unorthodox, sensible individual, someone that is seeking to be deliberately kind of out of the ordinary. Miss Prism and Dr. Chasuble arrive, and she sententiously declares that is obviously the reason why the primitive church has not lasted up to the present day. And you do not seem to realise, dear doctor, that by persistently remaining single, a man converts himself into a permanent public temptation. Men should be more careful. This very celibacy leads weaker vessels astray. And so there's this sense here of him being almost outside of society because of his celibacy. You know, that he keeps himself outside of society, and because of his celibacy, ends up becoming a temptation. And so I think there's a really good comparison to be made there between the way that in Streetcar and Desire Under the Elms, sort of sexual desire seems inevitable, and it seems to be the case here is that even if you make you take yourself out of the interactions of society, you end up anyway being a greater attraction because of that withdrawal. Miss Prism says that depends on the intellectual sympathies of the woman. No married man is ever attractive except to his wife. I've been told not even to her. That depends on the intellectual sympathies of the woman. Maturity can always be depended upon. Ripeness can be trusted. Young women are green. I spoke horticulturally. My metaphor was drawn from fruit. But where is Cecily? So again, she deliberately here echoes the language that Chasuble uses earlier on in the play. But here I think their seduction is actually in many ways shrouded by language that I think invites us to kind of compare the way that Goldberg and Lulu come together in The Birthday Party, is that they deliberately reflect here on almost the evasive quality of language, that maturity can always be depended upon, ripeness can be trusted, young women are green. You know, there's this, the abstract qualities of the figurative language here are in many ways what is revealing the way that they're almost trying to shroud the honest intentions of their romance here. Jack enters slowly from the back garden. He's dressed in the deepest mourning, with crepe hat band and black gloves. And so there's this sense here of dejection that's ominous, I think, like Stanley's costume in in a birthday party, but it's actually for a reverse reason here. Jack is for the affirmation of his identity through his baptism, and he has complete control over the nature of his identity, whereas Stanley is dressed up in this suit after his identity has been taken from him. And so we have that sense here of actually being fixed in an authentic identity in Wilde's play is actually something that loses you freedom, which is the opposite to what Pinter seems to be suggesting to us, that losing your individuality is akin to losing your your entire life. Now, they're talking here about Ernest dying. Your brother Ernest dead, quite dead. What a lesson for him. I trust he will profit by him. Now again, the hollowness of the values here, I think, and the language that's rendered in invite comparison with that failed articulation of purpose in Goldberg's speech in the final act. I believe that the world, I believe that the world. Because there's no way in which this would be possible. That Goldberg and McCann can't articulate a rationale, and these values have no logical basis for them whatsoever. There is no way that you can profit by something once you're dead. And then Jack says, no, he died abroad in Paris. In fact, I had a telegram last night from the manager of the Grand Hotel. Was the cause of death mentioned? A severe chill, it seems. As a man sows, so he shall reap. Charity, dear Miss Prism, charity. None of us are perfect. I myself am peculiarly susceptible to drafts. And so there's this suggestion here of morality, but it's actually missing. And I think that what we're seeing through these character interactions is precisely the vacuity and emptiness that Stanley Weber is able to identify in orthodox social norms in the birthday party, and that is what he's so resistant to and wants to distance himself from. Chasuble says, in Paris, and further down, my sermon on the meaning of the manna in the wilderness can be adapted to almost any occasion, joyful, as in the present case, or distressing. This is incredibly important as a comparison, showing us the vacuity of the meaning of the sermon and the malleability of the language. I think inevitably invites comparison with Goldberg's speeches on the necessary and the possible. We have that moment in the play where he talks at one point, and he uses that language and that vocabulary in an interrogation, but then it's adapted to a moment of ritual celebration. So that language transfer from those two different contexts underlines its inauthenticity and its malleability, and that's what we see here in Chasuble's explanations about his sermon. That reminds me, you mentioned christenings, I think, Dr. Chasuble. I suppose you know how to christen all right. I mean, of course, you are continually christening, aren't you? And Miss Prism says, it is, I regret to say, one of the rector's most constant duties in this parish. I have often spoken to the poorer classes on the subject, but they don't seem to know what thrift is. So there's an enormous irony here in these lines, and a sense of class superiority. That he's constantly christening. The implication, first of all, is that the poorer classes are creating children, and because of that, he's very busy christening their babies. But that sense of class hostility is very, very stark and clear in this particular moment in the play. Further over, Miss Prism is bitter. People who live entirely for pleasure usually are, and she's talking here about people being unmarried. And then Jack says, but it is not for any child, dear doctor. I am very fond of children. No, the fact is I would like to be christened myself this afternoon if you have nothing better to do. But surely, Mr. Worthing, you've been christened already. I don't remember anything about it. But have you any grave doubts on the subject? I certainly intend to have. Of course, I don't know if the thing would bother you in any way, or if you think I'm a little too old now. So there's here the emptiness of these rituals, this ritual that is supposed to be about the affirmation of identity, about the authenticity of your individuality and its soul and your potential ascent into heaven, is here being exposed as a performance, of course, because we know that what is being affirmed behind the name is a sham, an illusion that is designed to allow this particular individual a greater deal of power and freedom. Chasuble down the bottom says, Admiral, and takes out his watch. And now, dear Mr. Worthing, I will not intrude any longer into a house of sorrow. I would merely beg you not to be too much bowed down by grief. What seem to us bitter trials are often blessings in disguise. And Miss Prism says, this seems to be a blessing of an extremely obvious kind. So we're talking here about babies, above, that Jenkins, we're talking about a real kind of atrocity here. That he says, a case of twins that occurred recently in one of the outlying cottages on your own estate. Jenkins is the carter, most hard-working man. I don't see much fun in being christened along with other babies. It would be childish. And so, further down, he seems to this hysterical overestimation of the flaw here, and also of having to be christened alongside babies, but also, I think, a kind of cruel language of orthodoxy here, an extremely obvious blessing that, in many ways, I think shows us how unkind these figures are throughout the play. Further down, Jack and Cecily interact here. And then Cecily talks about Ernest. He arrived here about half an hour ago. What nonsense. I haven't got a brother. Oh, don't say that. However badly he may have behaved to you in the past, he's still your brother. You couldn't be so heartless as to disown him. I'll tell him to come out, and you will shake hands with him, won't you, Uncle Jack? Runs back into the house. So this dramatic irony here is based on her lack of awareness of the truth, which itself is also a lie. That she's completely unaware that Algernon isn't Jack's brother, and there's, of course, a great dramatic irony in that. He isn't the brother Ernest. But, of course, actually, that lack of awareness of this truth ends up actually becoming a lie. That truth that Algernon is not his brother ends up becoming a lie because he ends up becoming his brother. So we have this infinite sort of proliferating chain of irony and distancing going on. And Cecily says, when she runs back into the house, and Chasuble says, these are very joyful tidings. After we had all been resigned to his loss, his sudden return to me seems to me peculiarly distressing. So this enormous sense of cruelty in these orthodox values that Miss Prism seems to be the most vocal representative of, particularly alongside Lady Bracknell. They expose an element of hypocrisy that clearly values the sort of the certainty and the stability of what's gone already. Somehow it's distressing to have someone come back to life because we thought we'd killed him off. Then, my brother is in the dining room. I don't know what it all means. I think it's perfectly absurd. And Algernon and Cecily enter hand in hand. They come up slowly to Jack. Good heavens! So we have this sort of exposure here of the mistaken identity. Well, on the part of Cecily, but of course Jack and Algernon both know what's going on here. Brother John, I've come down from town to tell you that I'm very sorry for all the trouble I've given you, and that I intend to lead a better life in the future. And he glares at him and does not take his hand. So we have this sense of them both being duplicitous, and at this moment in time, their fabrications are what is making them vulnerable. And so there is this moment of potential comparison with Blanche. But obviously, what ends up happening in this play is that their fabrications end up coming true, and they end up actually meeting the expectations of those performances. Jack, Cecily, and Algernon then talk about Bunbury. Jack says, oh, has he been talking about Bunbury, has he? Yes, he's told me about poor Mr. Bunbury and his terrible state of health. Bunbury, well, I won't have him talk to you about Bunbury or anything else. It's enough to drive one perfectly frantic. And then Algernon says, of course, I admit that the faults were all on my side, but I must say that I think that Brother John's coldness to me is peculiarly painful. I expected a more enthusiastic welcome, especially considering it's the first time I've come here. So he's actually able to manipulate conventions here to gain power, and there's he's manipulating the ritual and the convention of a kind of polite society welcome here to gain a sense of power over Jack and to gain leverage over him effectively in this sort of duplicitous false identity scenario that they've constructed. And I think that it directly compares to the way that Goldberg and McCann are able to maneuver those scenarios, particularly of greetings, of entrances and exits in the play, formal entrances and exits that actually, in many ways, are about their assertion of power and their hostility. Merriman enters. Merriman says, I've put Mr. Ernest's things in the room next to yours, sir. I suppose that's all right. And Jack says, what? Mr. Ernest's luggage. I've unpacked it and put it in the room next to your own. His luggage, yes, sir. 3 portmanteaus, a dressing case, 2 hat boxes, and a large luncheon basket. I'm afraid I can't stay more than a week this time. Merriman, order the dog cart at once. Mr. Ernest has been suddenly called back to town. Yes, sir. What a fearful liar you are, Jack. I've not been called back to town at all. Yes, you have. I haven't heard anyone call me. Your duty as a gentleman calls you back. My duty as a gentleman has never interfered with my pleasures in the smallest degree. And so this is a really important version that exposes, I think, the comedy of manners here. That there's a sense of imposition that Algernon makes in bringing all of his things here, based on a kind of fabricated identity, which is ever so much like what Blanche does at the beginning of Streetcar. But Jack is equally vulnerable to the truth, and so is also able to lie at this particular moment in time. And so what they end up doing is kind of calling each other's bluff through these polite language rituals of your duty of a gentleman calls you back. You know, there's this sense of social orthodoxy that's actually preventing them from trying to undergo these the freedom that these fabricated identities allow for. And so, in many ways here, their freedom that's enabled by their identity fabrication contrasts with Blanche, because her false sense of self is completely at odds with the surroundings, whereas these two both have the ability to kind of navigate either the country or the city and have a greater sense of freedom, and so their fabrications end up becoming reality. Algernon later down says, I don't like your clothes. You look perfectly ridiculous in them. Why on earth don't you go up and change? It's perfectly childish to be in deep mourning for a man who is actually staying for a whole week with you in your house as a guest. I call it grotesque. So once again, you know, there's this moment where, you know, Jack's lying is being exposed by another lie, and so we have this endless sort of proliferating chain of fabrication where there's no truth at the bottom of it. So if we track this, you know, Jack's pretense to have killed off Ernest, which is itself a lie, and so is Ernest, is now being exposed by a lie that Algernon is enacting himself. So there's three types of lies involved in this sort of surface, the maintenance of this surface of performative experience and the insistence upon manners and good form in social situations. And so what we're seeing underneath that is a kind of a hollow core beneath that surface of inauthentic experience. Algernon says, I certainly won't leave you so long as you are in mourning. It would be most unfriendly. If I were in mourning, you would stay with me, I suppose. I should think it very unkind if you didn't. So again, he manipulates the social codes with his guise and says, actually, but it's ridiculously ironic, because I'm going to stay here because you're in mourning, but you're actually in mourning for the person that I'm pretending to be. And so he's having his cake and eating it at the same time. But, you know, I'm going to stay here because it's a good thing to do, but I'm staying here because you are mourning the death of the person that I'm pretending to be, and therefore the fact that I'm here undermines the whole purpose of your mourning in the first place.